welcome. Great to see so many of you joining us. I'm very delighted to welcome you as ever on behalf of the How To Academy. I'm thrilled that you have decided to be here. You're in for a real treat, a fascinating conversation over the next hour. And I can say that with certainty, having read the book that we're going to be basing the conversation around. It's certainly, exactly as I say, page-turningly fascinating, as you will hear. Here it is in my screen. Crack Up Capitalism, Market Radicals, and the Dream of a World Without Democracy. So I am thrilled to have the author of this here himself to enlighten us. I'm not going to say any more because it's his words you've signed in to listen to. Quinn Slobodian is the Professor of History of Ideas at Wellesley College, Massachusetts, which I think is possibly one of the best job titles I can think of. And exactly, history of ideas is something we're going to be delving into during our conversation, a very specific idea, of course, of crack up capitalism. He's been a residential fellow at Harvard University, the University of Hong Kong, the Free University Berlin, and the University of Bologna. He's the author as well as Crack Up Capitalism of Globalists, The End of Empire and the Birth of Neoliberalism. And he's also a frequent contributor. I'm sure many of you might have read his work in The Guardian, The New Statesman, The New York Times, and other places. So Quinn, hugest thanks for joining us, and great thanks for such a fascinating read.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
And I mean, the first question writes itself, because anyone listening who hasn't yet read the book will probably instantly want to know, what is crack up capitalism? Did you coin this phrase? Why have you chosen to choose the book, choose the title Crack Up Capitalism for the book?
I did coin the phrase. I think that it came to me when I was trying to sort of encapsulate what is slightly seemingly contradictory set of ideas that's at the heart of the book. The idea is that as we become ever more interconnected economically, we don't necessarily become ever more interconnected politically. And in fact, the spaces within which we organize politically often become smaller and smaller. So we're familiar with this conversation about sort of the era of globalization, followed by, I suppose, a backlash towards the nation a few years ago. But in fact, as I try to show in the book, and as an empirical question, capitalism is organized beneath the surface of the nation state, focused in all kinds of areas, warehouses, industrial parks, international financial centers, zones of all kinds, as I call them in the book. And the politics of people who are trying to kind of push capitalism into a new way of organizing politics altogether have a kind of vision of breaking up the political entities of nations that we have now into things that would more resemble the spaces of everyday business. So I'm kind of trying to capture both a kind of empirical fact, which is capitalism is not just national and global, it goes below that level, and also a kind of self-conscious political project that some radical libertarians, so-called anarcho-capitalists, have been articulating, writing books about, exploring for the last several decades.
Yes, because the subtitle is Market Radicals and the Dream of a World Without Democracy. Did you write it out of concern and worry?
Absolutely. I mean, I, like everyone else, was and have been pretty shaken by the resurgence of ethno-nationalism and especially anti-immigrant sentiment and an unwillingness to come to collective decision-making and collective processes around, global challenges, especially around climate change and global warming. And I was, like everyone else, reading all of the books and the kind of newspaper articles and editorials that people were writing about this over the last years. But something struck me as a little bit off in the way that the writing was happening, or at least it felt like there was something missing. The problem to me was it felt like in the flood of books about the death of democracy or the end of democracy over the last few years, democracy was often talked about as something that just existed within the political realm. Democracy is something you do every 4 years or every 3 years, go to the ballot box, or it's something about the vitality or lack thereof of the public sphere. But rarely, it seemed to me, was the sort of dangers that democracy found itself in linked to the economic in terms of the way that people organize the world according to motives of profit, motives of accumulation, motives of production. And it seemed to me that, in fact, that if we wanted to get to the heart of something like why Trump, for example, would have been a danger as a continued leader of the United States, it isn't only that he, is someone who is violently opposed to people of other races, especially from the southern, the states south of the United States, but it's also because he was bringing into government the sort of practices of smash and grab real estate capitalism of the kind that he had made his millions at. Someone like Boris Johnson or Jacob Rees-Mogg, similarly, although often just talked about as cultural figures, either praised or criticized, are also people who are conversant in the world of free markets and capitalism, investment and finance. And my intention with the book was to sort of open up that conversation to say that we need to see democracy as under threat, not just by politics, but by, in fact, the successes of certain kinds of undemocratic capitalism, whether it's in Dubai or Singapore or Hong Kong, places that have developed authoritarian forms of market economics, which are now being actually emulated by many politicians back in the industrialized Western countries.
There's so many things I want to sort of touch on and certainly go back and explore a bit of the history, but you've mentioned immigration and sort of racist rhetoric quite a bit in your answer just there. So it's something that I was really fascinated to hear your thoughts on. I mean, at a point in the book, you say we often speak of successionist and far-right movements such as neo-Confederates in purely political or cultural terms, as you were just saying. Mm-hmm. And, you say as figures sometimes with a pathologized fixation on ethnicity that crowds out all economic concerns, but this is wrong. We should think of the radical politics of the 1990s here, you talk about in terms of capitalism. But is it not that essentially the economics is being used to justify a sort of xenophobia and a racism and a us and them narrative?
Well, that's a tough question. I mean, sort of to try to look into the hearts of certain politicians and say, which is first, the sort of the fear of other populations or a desire for some kind of profit motive. I think that the two things are often not working that well in concert with each other, actually. I mean, if you think about the desires of the bottom line of a hard-nosed capitalist would be often that you would want to be able to have access to a reserve supply of surplus labor when you needed it, sort of on call, right? And then be able to get rid of it when you didn't want it. So historically, people have often assumed that capitalists would be for open borders or for the possibility of liberalized immigration. One of the things that I've written about elsewhere is that even the Wall Street Journal, the high organ of American capitalism, every 4th of July, right up into the 1980s, would publish an editorial calling for open borders, the abolition of passport control, the abolition of borders. So we're kind of, I would say, more used to thinking about capitalism as such, as being interested in access to this cheap factor of production, which is labor, regardless of the social consequences. But in fact, one of the things that I show in the book is that there are kind of ways of squaring this apparent paradox that have been developed specifically in two of the places I just mentioned, Dubai and Singapore, two places that have a small minority of residents in their territory who are actually citizens. And in fact, between 75 and 90% of the people who live in a place like Dubai or Abu Dhabi or Singapore are not citizens, nor do they have the rights of citizens. So there's a way of creating a kind of a squaring of the circle where you can have access to cheap immigration as much as you want, hire and fire and deport, but also have a kind of exclusive club of people who are insiders who get the benefits of citizenship. And I think that a lot of the torment that you see, for example, right now in the British Conservative Party is an attempt to try to figure out this problem, right? Does it make sense economically to exclude people even when you need, employees in low-wage service sectors? Or can you come to a kind of hydraulic model whereby you allow people in, but at a second tier sort of guest worker status so that you can expel them when not necessary? That actually is although it's not a headline part of the sort of zone as I describe it in the book, it's a very important part, I think, of this radical capitalist sort of solution to having a world where goods and money can move freely, but there's are all kind of locks and dikes and derricks to kind of keep people from moving any place that they're not economically necessary.
So interesting. You've mentioned zones a lot of times, and zones are sort of essential to the book. You say, looking around the world, we see zones everywhere. Again, I'm sorry to people who immediately understand that, but some may not. And so could you clarify the zone? And
Sure.
When you say we see zones everywhere, do you feel they're on the rise? And if so, why? And what does that mean?
Sure. So, I mean, I'm a historian and I teach classes on global history and international history. And usually when we teach the 20th century, there's one thing that we would all generally agree on, which is the beginning of the 20th century, you had a world of empires, especially European empires with their colonies, their holdings overseas. And then across the 20th century, slowly you get decolonization and the end of overseas empire. So you move from a world of empires, the beginning of the 20th century, to a world of nation states at the end. That much, I think, is true. But what my book sort of suggests and shows is that in the process, beginning in the 1960s, accelerated into the 80s and 90s, what happens is, especially in poorer countries who are seeking mobile investment, there's a kind of a willingness to take parts of their own national territory and ring fence them and create new laws inside of those zones, new sets of regulations, often lifting planning requirements, lifting labor regulations, making it in different ways hospitable and inviting for mobile foreign investors to come in and build a factory or build a call center or build a warehouse. The number of these zones, these sort of quasi-extraterritorial spaces, has really gone vertically from the 1980s up to the present. So from a kind of a few dozen at the end of the 1970s of these so-called special economic zones, you now have upwards of 6,000 globally, with new ones being proposed really all the time. The United Kingdom, the case in point are the free ports that are currently top of the leveling up agenda for Rishi Sunak. Exactly the same idea, based indeed on the models of Hong Kong, Jebel Ali Free Zone, and the United Arab Emirates. The idea being, the only way you get ahead in this cutthroat kind of race to the bottom globally for the lowest taxes and the lowest regulations is you kind of cede a little bit of sovereignty. So the intention of the book is to sort of preserve that idea of the world of empires moving to a world of nations, but also to then show how there are these perforations actually in nation states, even after decolonization, that have a kind of, they have an ambiguous potential. They can be tools of the state to just bring in investors, but they can also be places that can kind of model, as I try to argue in miniature, a version of non-democratic capitalism that can become attractive to more authoritarian leaders in other parts of the world.
So in general, would you say zones and the idea of zones and the aspiring towards zones is itself a direct threat to democracy?
I mean, it is insofar as it has generally been used to kind of create end runs around especially local governments, but also around sets of regulations that have been established over some democratically legitimated period of time, right? So very, very expressly, something like the creation of an enterprise zone in the Isle of Dogs, for example, at the beginning of the 1980s, which is what ended up eventually producing Canary Wharf, was done explicitly against, for example, the local socialism of the Greater London Council under Ken Livingstone at the time. So that example would replicate itself in many places, and sometimes the policies that people put into place inside of those zones aren't necessarily regressive. So there are attempts to do sort of environmentally friendly zones where you actually have higher regulations or more environmental standards, because some developing countries think that will be attractive to mobile investors in this more environmentally sensitive climate. But by and large, they're really used as a way to kind of erode national control and kind of local self-determination.
Yes, I mean, you say, I was looking for the sort of quote, you said in that example you give of London is it shows the zone as the dagger aimed at the heart of socialism, and the examples you give of just every attempt to have sort of community spirit and to set up social activities, to set up sort of, places where people can congregate, that all is lost in the aim of the zone, economic aim of the zone.
Yeah, and that quote actually, that's from the historian Paul Johnson, who was celebrating the zone for being, as you say, a dagger aimed at the heart of socialism, and that it captures something, because one could think that these are just sort of banal instruments of local community planning, and that I'm kind of hyping them up or dramatizing them by describing them the way that I am. But one of the things that the book does, I'm a historian, so I'm very close to the sources, and it's chock full of footnotes, maybe too many footnotes, my editor thought. But you can see the way that people, especially, to stick with the British example from the Adam Smith Institute and the Institute of American Affairs, for them, there was a kind of swashbuckling kind of excitement to this idea of creating zones inside of social democracies. It was an idea of trying to very consciously bring back the kind of frontier spirit, or the kind of imperial spirit, the maritime seagoing spirit, and bring it back into the metropole. So just as John Raffles or Stamford Raffles had gone to Singapore and sort of planted the British flag and created a free port in the middle of Southeast Asia, the celebration of kind of bringing that spirit back into the British Isles is very much a kind of an extension of kind of imperial seagoing project, now brought back home to roost, so to speak.
You say about Singapore that, because there's often this aspiration that we will be like Singapore, become like Singapore, this idea that sort of Singapore is the sort of paragon, I think you call it, of crack up capitalism that we aspire to. That was a lot of the Brexit rhetoric was based around this idea that that's what we wanted. But you say that actually Britain cannot become like Singapore to solve its problems, because Singapore has similar problems. And the argument over the meaning of what Singapore actually is part of a larger argument over the future of capitalism itself.
Yeah. I mean, to be honest, as someone who's, maybe it's already obvious, like my sympathies are more on the left, would be, and the sort of the Corbyn wing of the Labour Party, insofar as that used to exist. I was still kind of disappointed in the way that the Corbyn camp used this idea of turning Britain into a Singapore after Brexit as just kind of a simplistically negative slur. The idea that, becoming Singapore would just be abhorrent. Why would anyone want to be Singapore? I think that shows is little curiosity in a way about what Singapore actually is, as people who reduce it to just an idea of streamlined, low tax, free trade, hyper capitalism. I think that when you actually look at these places in their complexity, whether it's Hong Kong, where I try to show as much like democratic impulses as I do in anti-democratic institutions, or Singapore, where there is indeed quite a robust social state and a high level of the public ownership of housing, a very interventionist sovereign wealth fund, and a state that's willing to spend on infrastructure and spend on research and development, then I think the question is less like, do we or don't we want to be like country X? But it should be a prompt for us to understand the complexity of country X, right? And then when we do that, we can actually see, well, places are not just born off of being chosen off of a menu and reassembled elsewhere, even though Singapore is often treated that way. But places have their own, as we say in history, like path dependency. They exist for a reason, and you usually can't simply replicate, for example, the success of a port city at the choke point between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. You can't pick that up and replicate it anywhere else without having had the same 1,000 years of history. So this is part of, I think, like why, as my editor never stopped sort of reminding me that my book is quite complicated, because I'm not really willing to just go along with the caricature, the stereotype one way or the other. I actually want to kind of follow my characters into these places and then to try to build out their history a bit so that we can see that places are usually neither one thing or the other. They often contain sort of features of different possible futures.
You talk about characters, you're following your characters, and there are some extraordinary characters in this book. I mean, you call it crack up capitalism. Some of the characters here who are some of the most eccentric people, you sort of think it could be called crackpot capitalism, because perhaps you could tell us about some of them. And I'm not saying that, for example, Milton Friedman, Peter Thiel, who you describe, are those people, but tell us about some of the people who are these market radicals with this dream through history into today that you follow. Sure.
Yeah, I mean, that's been one of the interesting things about the reception of the book too, is I think that there are some pretty far out, eccentric, dramatis people in the dramatis personae. And it's been remarkable to me how some people have not been sort of deterred by that to try to discover good things about the book. I mean, case in point, former Chancellor of the Exchequer, Kwasi Kwarteng, who said that, in his review of the book in The Spectator, Quinn Slobodian seems to think these people are a joke, but, utopias are hard to build and so on. And so he ends up kind of recovering in a way the spirit of the people in the book. But some of them, I mean, I'll just name one in particular who I think captures some of the essence of what I'm trying to get at. It's this Dutch lawyer named Michael van Nauten, who begins doing very sort of typical think tanker kind of things, like translates Hayek and Friedman into Dutch, hosts the Mont Pelerin Society, starts a think tank in Brussels, trying to push for lower taxes inside the European community in the 1980s, but then kind of gets bored of this and ends up advising for the United Nations in Djibouti in the Horn of Africa. But while he's there, the Somali civil war breaks out in the 1990s. And instead of kind of fleeing for his life, he ends up sort of going in the opposite direction and creating an alliance with the local warlord and trying to develop what he calls a constitution for a stateless society. So he marries a local woman. He starts to find investors, including a set of teenagers in Houston who started their own country in their parents' basement. He gets a Texas businessman involved. And meanwhile, he's trying to figure out how to graft together Somali customary law with 21st century commercial business law. So how can you create, as he thought of it, a white man's business clan in stateless Somalia that could serve as a kind of a means of solving disputes without having a state altogether. He ends up getting ratted out through a series of kind of leaks on the internet and booted out of the country. But this sort of like rise and fall picaresque story of this sort of Dutch libertarian wild man ends up kind of landing in somewhat more complex territory in the chapter even itself, because I show that his vision was that, capitalism can exist without states. Most people would think that's ridiculous. But in fact, Somalia in the 1990s, as development economists showed, actually did better than it had in the 1980s under an authoritarian government. Per capita income rose, exports rose, the strength of the currency rose, despite the fact the central bank had been looted and destroyed. So there's a kind of a way that there's a kernel of truth to even some of the most far out ideas. And indeed, the very place that this fellow was planning a deepwater harbor on the coast of Somaliland now has just opened in the last 6 months, a harbor operated not by sort of Dutch libertarians and Texan teenagers, but by DP World, the Dubai state-owned logistics company, which builds ports all over the world and also, by the way, owns P&O ferries in the UK.
I mean, you mentioned Dubai there. Would you say that Dubai is an example of a currently functioning zone, very well functioning zone?
Dubai is a great example because it doesn't have oil the way that Abu Dhabi does. It doesn't have natural gas the way that Qatar does. So that it required some creativity on the part of the sheikh and his family and the advisors who he was able to bring in. What the advisors and he came up with was to create Dubai not as a single zone, but as a kind of a honeycomb of different zones. So the first thing was to create this space called Jebel Ali, which became one of the most important sort of offshore spaces where you could put things together, store things without having any duty, where you could buy land inside the Emirates for the first time. And they took it further and built, special zones for healthcare, for media, for internet, for financial center. And each of these was kind of blank slate style, right? They just said, okay, here's a line on the map, and it's not a big map because it's not a big patch of territory. And they brought in an Australian investment lawyer and said, what would the perfect laws be? What kind of laws would you love to have? What would your clients love to have? Gives them a laundry list. They're like, okay, those are the laws. And what about where can we take our disputes to? Well, you could take them to the British Privy Council back in the United Kingdom, because people trust that, the sort of former British protector still here. So this kind of a patchwork assembly of different functioning components of the global economic scene is something that is very hard to pull off, but for sure Dubai did. And because Dubai did now, it has inspired like a whole series of consultants, sometimes sort of starry-eyed mavericks, to think that any country should be able to do this. So at present, Peter Thiel is funding a group trying to do this in the suburbs of Lagos in Nigeria. Until recently, there was prospects for something like this in Honduras, a kind of a territory cleared of local legislation on a blank slate onto which foreign investors could kind of write their own set of laws and bring in capital from overseas to operate in a relatively unregulated and ungoverned space.
You mentioned Honduras. It's a really interesting example, and it comes in the chapter that you call Silicon Valley colonialism. But you just said that didn't happen, or it happened, but it's actually sort of been reversed because, as you say, you call them, old-fashioned elections. Democracy took its revenge. So I'm just wondering, you talk about Honduras and then Prospera, which I think is just off Honduras. And in both places, this idea of having a zone and creating what you've just explained didn't happen because ultimately a sort of longing, a clamor, dream of democracy, whatever you want to call it, prevailed. So I just wonder if sort of the story of that, and perhaps even of Hong Kong, makes you feel less wary of, I guess the subtitle of your book, a world without democracy being the eventual place we get to.
Absolutely. I mean, it's important that it says a dream of a world without democracy. But I think that captures what I try to do in the book, is to kind of toggle between, on the one hand, the speculative fantasies of some of these political thinkers, which are often, by the way, in close conversation with the speculative thought worlds of often science fiction novelists and sort of cyberpunk novelists. Some who were often a direct inspiration to the people that I'm describing. It's not for nothing that the metaverse as a category, was first used in Neil Stephenson's novel Snow Crash from 1992, which, better than almost any other book, really captures this fantasy zone world that that many people I'm describing as trying to make come into being. So the sort of method of the book is to sort of build up the fantasy, show that the fantasy is not as far from reality as we might think or might hope, as the Somali example I just showed might show. Honduras is another example of this, because you have had export processing zones in Honduras driving the economy in often unhealthy ways for decades, meaning places where labor rights don't apply, normal forms of taxation don't apply. A Canadian, underwear manufacturer comes in and basically gets their own patch of territory and their own low-wage labor force. To build what they call, thinking of as like a charter city or a more exaggerated form of the zone, is only one tick farther from what already exists. But it turns out that to actually say you're creating something that is almost equivalent to a state and not just inside of a state is a rather large jump, even if the leap doesn't seem so large. And in Honduras, indeed, the backlash against this, the creation of this place called Prospera on an island off the north coast of Honduras, has been rather great, and it led really to the victory of a left-wing candidate late last year. So I think that the Honduras example shows, the Hong Kong example shows that, we can't sort of expect a frictionless construction of a world on this principle. We can't expect it. I don't think we would predict that. But it's significant to me that there would be people who feel, I think correctly, that they're kind of capturing part of the zeitgeist of the moment when they think that they can organize the world this way, right? We already in everyday life deal with each other often through money, contract, commodities, maybe even insurance companies or arbitration. What my characters, the anarcho-capitalists, are suggesting is, well, what if we just kept on doing that and then just eliminated that part that's easily forgotten where you go to the ballot box once every couple of years, right? What if we just took the everyday forms of commercialized togetherness and just made that our whole reality, which is at once both very easy to imagine and seems very far-fetched. And I think it's that sort of ping-ponging between speculation and recognition that I wanted to get across in the book. But the bottom line for sure is that for the most part, the countries who successfully use this zoning strategy, they have the zones pretty well in harness. I mean, China is the place that has the most of these special economic zones. There's no sign of kind of an anarcho-capitalist wave from southern China washing over Beijing. That's not happening. The system of incentives and oversight is well in place. Dubai, similarly, it's not going to sort of break free and become a properly sort of libertarian world. For one thing, they're not interested in political freedom or civil freedom, civic freedom. So I think that in the here on planet Earth, as opposed to the fantasies of a lot of my characters, the zone does still really remain a tool of the state rather than a tool against the state. But I think just calling attention to that tension there between national states and then the tools they use inside of themselves to kind of reorganize economic activity is something that I wanted to bring into more public discussion.
In a moment, because there's lots of questions coming in, they're always brilliant questions from the How To Academy audiences, but I want to just ask you about something you mentioned at the end, but which underlies obviously much of the book and many of the characters and the examples of the places. You say successionism is also driven by a desire to flight for safety. And you're talking about climate change largely at this time. I suppose the worrying thing is that really in that scenario, it is for the wealthy and the extremely wealthy to choose to be able to flee to safety, and the rest, what happens to them?
Yeah, and in fact, I'm glad you picked up on that phrase, because it was a phrase that sort of kept on bouncing around my head, and it actually comes from more like the financial press. Like a flight to safety is when there's an economic crisis, would mean that usually it means you take your investments out of sort of equities and you put them in something like gold or United States treasuries. And it occurred to me that when we were talking about kind of nationalist backlash or right-wing populism, it was often discussed as if it was kind of an atavism, like people would go back to quote unquote tribal instincts, or like return to kind of pre-modern circling of the wagons is the metaphor that's often used in the United States. But I think that the way you could also think about it is more like in financial investment terms, which is, you know, when under threat, people used a kind of investment strategy to say like, well, what has been a good bet? Well, the nation has been a good bet. I'm going to take a flight to safety, meaning I'm going to sort of reinvest psychically and sometimes literally in my whiteness, in my nationality,
Right.
in sometimes often literally in things like gold, because they get skeptical about the value of the euro or the pound or whatever. Then, you know, one can make it even more literal. And I was inviting that interpretation too, which is to like, you know, relocate to places that are beyond rising sea levels, sites of climate catastrophe, and so on. And I think that you know, whether or not that will be only the possibility for the very wealthy, I'm not so sure. I think that, you know, the United States is a place that's characterized by extreme inequality, but it is not a place in which sort of like the 1% exactly dominates the 99%, right? I think there is a good solid, like, as the sociologist Matthew Desmond has been reminding us, a good solid sort of 25%, which has managed to kind of rig schooling systems, rigged zoning systems and gerrymandering so that they can more or less be protected from redistribution without actually having to think of themselves as, Peter Thiel characters. So when push comes to shove in the United States, right, it's going to be like who gets the seawall that's municipally funded versus who is forced to relocate from what will be called now sacrifice zones, right? And I think that the line will probably not fall exactly around like a micro minority and then everyone else. I think it's going to become more of like a, 1/3, 25% of the US against a slight majority. And that's going to play out in all kinds of probably unpleasant to watch kind of new frontiers of grotesque urbanism, which I think we can be expecting as the gated community, which I describe in the book as having been a real topic in the 1990s, especially, will probably return as perhaps a more like climate-induced necessity for refuge.
Yeah, the gated community, I mean, is that the gated community in the US you give sort of specific examples to, but you also talk about, I think you mentioned Margaret Thatcher living in a gated community. I mean, yep. Is a gated community an example of a zone?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the reasons I brought it up in the book is that I myself vaguely remember from the 90s, sort of as a child, this being like a specter of the disintegration of the social fabric. People are very worried about gated communities. And in retrospect, they seem slightly overblown. But what was interesting about them for me was looking back at the time is some of my actors were very excited about gated communities because they were kind of private states within the state at some level. You pay for your own security, you pay for your own services, you pay for in some cases, your own educational supplies. So they were like, maybe we can secede internally, do what they called soft secession, and create contract-based communities that are not democracies. If you buy a plot, you get a vote. You buy two, you get 2 votes. It's based on, one owner, 1 vote, not one citizen or resident, 1 vote. So the model of the gated community is very much one example of this sort of zone logic, as is in the case of London, for example, the many sort of privately owned public spaces like Canary Wharf itself, where usual laws, for example, of assembly and protest, those kind of rights don't apply because these places are not part of the public sphere. They're part of a kind of private space that is only nominally within the space of the democratic and public oversight.
Well, reluctantly, I'm going to stop asking my own questions, but not that reluctantly, because as I say, as always, really brilliant questions coming in from the How To audience and people who are signed in listening. And just a quite bold, straight out there question to start from Carmen, which is, who do you think is the most anti-capitalist person in the West and in the East?
The most anti-capitalist? Well, it's interesting. I'm reading for review purposes right now Martin Wolf's book, which is about sort of some similar topics as mine, right? It's about the crisis of democratic capitalism. And it's interesting to me because, he is a nuanced and interesting and a humane capitalist, but he's nevertheless very much a kind of a good defender of capitalism, I think. And it's been interesting for me to see who he's most concerned about. And one of the groups that he is most concerned about, well, there's 2, other than Trump, who's now sort of off the public radar for the time being. There's one is the so-called degrowth movement. So the movement of environmentalists who believe that we simply cannot keep on producing as much carbon and consuming as much and burning through as much energy stocks as we have been. And we need to drastically slow down and maybe even go in reverse. This is one group that, Martin Wolf really dislikes, but so do people on the far right really dislike, because they have a shared belief in the need for kind of productivism of some kind. Wolf also really dislikes the modern monetary theorists, people who believe that you don't actually need to have like a balanced budget. You just need to, you can print as much money as you like as long as inflation doesn't kick in. It scares him a lot too, which makes me think that even though one might expect the answer to be like the few remaining Maoists out there or something, I think that kind of the degrowthers and the MMT people are probably the biggest kind of threat to even mainline liberal capitalism at the moment.
So you worry about that them as a threat?
I mean,
or do you have a point? It's really sorry, so sorry to interrupt. We did a really interesting, I thought, debate not long ago. Saying growth is a disaster for our planet and our. I can't remember. Yes, it was a debate, and it was really interesting points on both sides, and the audience kind of agreed it is a disaster. That's was the side that won over. So I'm interested that you sort of see that as them as a worrying group.
From a capitalist point of view, I mean, I don't see my function as to defend capitalism,
right?
But I think that, and as a historian, what I tend to do is not I sort of judge things through the actors of the time. And if I have to historicize the moment, I think he's a good person to historicize. But what I would say is that I think that capitalism is such the baseline sort of software with which we kind of encounter the world, that no good critique of it would be easily contemplated. So I think it would require something that pushes us beyond our ability to really conceive of what life would look like in that moment, right? So I think that for us to escape the terminal existential crisis that we've put ourselves in here, then it will require thinking just beyond the conceivable, which is what the demand of radical politics makes of us. And it's, I think, in a perverse way, I was attracted to the characters in the book, because even though they're doing that in the opposite direction, they're trying to imagine capitalism pushed to the limit, I still think there's a kind of a limberness in a way to their level of their commitment to their ideology that could model in the opposite direction what needs to be an equal willingness to commit to a world kind of beyond commodified life, beyond capitalism, because that's the only way we're going to get out of the growth-based death spiral that we've placed ourselves in.
So interesting. Yes, sorry. I was alluding to a debate we did. The pursuit of growth is a disaster for our country and our planet. If anyone's interested, it's available to listen to as a podcast. I found it a fascinating sort of debate. Claire asks, do you see the power soft of MNC and their tax practices and UK's non-dom tax status as a benefit or a drain on present day UK capitalism?
I mean, it seems to be helping to prop up a sort of stagnant, non-dynamic form of UK capitalism, right? I mean, I think that the kind of funny thing about the debate over corporate tax rates is that even someplace like Singapore, which is often held up as a kind of a paragon, as I mentioned before, and as I say in the book, actually doesn't have that much lower of a tax rate than Great Britain. That is not the reason that they have succeeded, right? I mean, I remember that a few years ago, there was the Heritage Foundation was trying to push for a lower corporate tax rate in the course of the eventually successful Donald Trump tax cuts. And they posted these things that were comparing the tax rate of the Seychelles to the United States and saying, look how much lower the tax rate is in the Seychelles than the United States. And it was one of those moments that led me on the path to this book, because I was like, what kind of a strange world are we living in where those would seem like comparable places? The needs, the size, the demographic, requirements, I mean, they're just not the same places. So the idea that tax rates are the beginning or the end of a policy model is itself, I think, laughable, right? I think it's based on a so-called idea of like negative freedom, idea that all we need to do is remove regulations and things will get better. One of the funny things I mentioned in the book is that after Brexit, when people from Johnson's and then later Sunak's team went out to speak to City of London financiers about what kind of regulations they would like to see cut, the financiers basically said to a person, we don't want you to cut any of them. We enjoy having regulations. We need to be a trustworthy environment for global investors. Like, we don't want to seem like a, reckless anarchic space here. So I think that the fetish of like low taxes and deregulation is a product less of actual existing practitioners of capitalism and more of their kind of ideological clerical class, which I would think of the kind of Tufton Street think tank world is like they're clerics of capitalism. They're not practitioners of capitalism. So perpetuating things like non-dom status or pushing for low tax rates as if keeping or getting rid of those things will solve or create more British problems is probably missing the main story.
Mike has some brilliant questions. I'm going to leap to your last question, Mike, because I think you've been listening to other questions and he now says, listening to what you have said and to other questions, the key question then is, should we be looking at another economic or political system beyond capitalism? And if so, what is it?
Well, I mean, that's the big question, isn't it? I mean, I think that if it depends on what your sort of goals are. I mean, if you want to increase the quality of life that people have in your country, then I think, to decommodify as much as possible of everyday life is the trend towards which people should be moving, right? And I think that you don't have to fantasize about that because, for all of its faults and sins, the NHS is an actual existing example of what that might look like, right? I mean, people might laugh at having to wait in line or be in endless waiting lists for operations and things like that. But I can guarantee, your average British person that whatever they experience with that truly decommodified state service of healthcare is leagues better than what the average American has to deal with living with the fear of being, pushed into bankruptcy or losing their home because of being afflicted by something like a rare form of cancer, right? Which they have to choose either treatment or death. So that the NHS wasn't created a million years ago. It was created after the Second World War in a moment when the idea of mainstream political economy was that parts of the economy need to be taken out of the market. They need to be not subject to constant competition or private tendering or battle to the bottom wage practices. That actually collective ownership of things is something that can work best for everybody. And I think that the idea that that's been tried and now we need to move on to new things is probably a false one. I think it's a good time to kind of recollectivize and re-socialize those services that everybody requires unequally.
Thank you. Another question is, as a historian, what would you like to say, looking back from 50 years in the future, had made a change in the right direction for the majority of humanity?
Well, that is, there's sometimes the joke is made that the idea of like a future historian is kind of a moot point because anywhere in the United States, the discipline of history is being decimated very quickly and we're not replacing ourselves as a professoriate because new lines are not being created. But let's posit for a sec that there are future historians. Then, I think that the thing that seemed within reach even a generation ago was the idea of something like international cooperation around, collective challenges or collective states of crisis. I actually, by coincidence, was just watching with my son a live performance of David Attenborough's Our Planet last night, and because of the Earth Day events. And one of the things they talk about there is the resolution on stopping whaling from 1986, right? This is a sort of a classic collective action problem where you would think that there would be too many people who would profit a great deal, who would be able to lobby to make sure that nothing like a ban on whaling would ever go through. But in fact, it did. So there is the kind of idea that even still seemed normal to me, someone born in the late 70s, when I was young, the idea of international cooperation didn't seem like a joke. Whereas now, after 27 rounds of climate, conferences, it's starting to feel like a prayer wheel-like practice of hypocrisy. What I would love to see is 50 years from now, we look back and show that that was wrong, that we were just in kind of a dip of multilateral cooperation and the ability to kind of set certain standards for ourselves, not for our own immediate well-being and enrichment, but for the needs of people 50 and 150 years in the future. So nothing is more important, I think, than ramping down high carbon energy use. And whatever we can do to get to that globally together is something that I would be, encouraged in my extreme old age to be able to look back and celebrate.
There's something I wanted to ask you about the opposite, really. I suppose we're talking about looking back from the future.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that you say in the book that I think is incredibly interesting is because of the difficulties of the practical realization in the present of some of these things that the anarcho-capitalists wish, they very often take refuge in the past. And I mean, I'm thinking of examples here. There's these sort of permanent allusions to the sort of sunlit uplands of the, people look back so much to imagine what they wish in this idea of zones and capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
Is that, wishful thinking, I suppose? Is it so often grounded in this kind of idea of something past? I mean, you talk about them harking back to the medieval times.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's really also something that there's things that you set out to say when you write a book, and then there's the things that as you write the book, you sort of realize that you've figured out that you hadn't before. And one of the things I think is about how our sense of progress in time has changed drastically in the last few decades. So reading back to the 1940s and 1950s, 60s, even this era of decolonization I was talking about, there really is a notion that was commonly held from socialist left to conservative right, that somehow we were all, like it or not, marching along the same timeline, whether you were in, Botswana or Tibet or Kansas City, you were all walking along the same path at different stages, but you would all eventually end up in some version of like industrialized, high consumption modernity. Eventually the world would be sort of paved over and filled with factories, and everyone would have enough to eat, and maybe eventually you'd only have a 6-hour workday or something, like Keynes's idea of what things would be like in a few decades. What really occurred to me as I was writing is how much, ironically, the end of the Cold War and the supposed end of history had actually been quite the opposite, that in fact, more than ever, people found that idea laughable, that we were all converging in the same place. Parts of the world, sub-Saharan Africa, for example, was just sort of fell off the map for investors and for international development agencies by the 2000s, places that were never going to develop or modernize. Inside of countries, large countries, especially like the United States, the idea that all of the states would eventually have some sort of a collective culture or be at the same level of economic development also has seemed more and more far-fetched. And in other words, smaller and smaller sort of sections of these large societies have sort of seen themselves on a timeline that they escapes the morass of the present, and other ones are, and then the devil take the hindmost, basically the idea that there should be some care that would extend to the boundaries of society in the model that someone like Beveridge rolled out in the 1940s when thinking about what a social welfare state should do, has been left for what the ecologist Garrett Hardin calls lifeboat ethics, which is this idea that you're on a lifeboat, it's only going to stay afloat if there's 8 people on it. If 2 more people try to get on, you have to hit them off with oars, or else the whole thing's going to sink. So that zero-sum attitude has, I think, also sparked some sort of strange short circuits of temporality, where people now think about the future as being like the time before modernity. So this idea of the breakup of big states into small feuding kind of city states in which law and order is privatized and there's no collective set of rights and obligations, which is what the anarcho-capitalists like about the Middle Ages. Something deep in the past could now look like something in the future, because we've skipped over that central thing of what modernity was, which is like a common sense of progress. When you've abandoned a common sense of progress, then strange hybrid historical forms start to reveal themselves, and you get into this cyberpunk world that is sort of half Middle Ages and feudal and half, hyper futuristic and technologized.
I'm going to ask one more question, and whether you can answer this in this amount of time, but hopefully don't mind staying a little bit later if it takes you a bit longer, because Anita asks, will zones ever become so autonomous you could describe them as anarcho-capitalist to the point where the state is unable to control the market within? I mean, I think you allude to that quite a lot in the book, that the state is not in control.
Yeah, well, that is, I think, the central question of these zones. And the people who are actually promoters of them, who like are consultants who go out and design them, work with private companies, work with governments, they're themselves split. So you have sort of a lot of them are coming from the libertarian corner, but half of them sort of think like these things are destined to be platforms for producing freer societies, as they understand it, economically freer. And others of them are more cynical, and they realize that, you know, when Modi in India creates a new special economic zone, he's really just creating a new node in like a patron client network that he can like give to his buddy Ambani, and then now they will support him in the next election, right? So the zone is, I think, usually a kind of an extension of the state rather than, as I said before, kind of the inverse of it. However, you do get the interesting possibility that is more like the one played out in a Neil Stephenson novel, where, for example, this original proposed zone in Honduras was supposed to have the full rights of kind of coming to trade treaties with other countries. It was going to negotiate alongside Honduras as its own entity. And then it was going to be a totally private equivalent of like a company state, or a private state a la the East India Company in the 19th century. That it wasn't realized, but the means of it to be realized are there. So who would you work with if you were suddenly a private state, not connected to any existing country of the United Nations? You'd have lots of people to work with. You do as they do. You work with KPMG, you work with McKinsey, you can float your stocks maybe in the Dubai Stock Exchange, you have third-party resources. So the world of so-called private ordering is a very thickly populated and robust one. And much of the global economy runs by sort of technically non-state entities. And to think of, and this is why it's become such an attractive thing for these libertarians to keep returning to. And they're just like, why can't we just go one step further? You know, if money is being managed across borders by private entities, if businesses are being guaranteed, if there is what the legal scholar Katerina Pistor calls a kind of code of capital that kind of rules, then why can't we just go one step further and live entirely in that private space? Why? Because the earth has been divided up already, right? There are no blank patches left on the map as much as they would love them to be. And it turns out that every time they try to carve out some little foothold somewhere in in Vanuatu in the South Pacific, or somewhere in Latin America, or somewhere in the Caribbean, then rightfully the residents of that place, people who have been there longer than them, stand up at some point and say, get lost. So for the time being, this is still the kind of the conundrum. Besides taking root in the virtual space of the metaverse, which is indeed where the book ends, so far it's unclear how you can actually re-seize and hold part of the earth to realize your libertopia.
It's absolutely fascinating. I said at the start, I mean, there was no doubt that it was going to be, and we could probably sit here all evening for us, afternoon for you, but it's time to let you go. Mike has really helpfully sent a link to Gapminder, just which I was just trying to sort of tap into. I don't think it's a link directly, Mike, so perhaps you could put that on a social channel and tag us. It looks really interesting, just in terms of the question about how important it is to understand, as you were saying, how much we've progressed. But thank you so much for your brilliant questions. And Quinn, thank you so much, as I said at the start, for being with us and for this absolutely fascinating insight and book, and happy publication. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Happy to be.